All right. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, co-sponsored by the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Our topic today is Safeguarding the Dignity of the Dead, International Perspectives on Mass Graves. This is the first of our two-part series on mass graves. Today, we'll focus on context-specific issues and broad challenges regarding mass graves and how human rights leaders and lawyers within these communities have continued to respond to these situations. My name is Vi Nguyen, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, we do want to take a moment to recognize Ronnie, who was scheduled to join us today to discuss this topic in the context of the Rohingya. Due to the horrific conditions in the Rakhine, Ronnie lost family members in an attack on Sunday perpetrated by the rebel armed group Arakan Army. Our condolences to him and Rohingya who've lost their lives, which is currently estimated to be over 200 since Sunday. We ask you to share a moment of silence with us for Ronnie and all those affected. Thank you. We turn now to the topic at hand. Today's webinar is intended to flow conversationally. There will be time at the end for questions and answers, but as we go along, please feel free to type your questions in the chat. Please note today's discussion will include graphic topics and images. We're privileged today to be joined by three exceptional speakers: Mr. Imran Mir, lawyer, entrepreneur, and author; Ms. Auring Shawways, founder of KG Lobby Center; and Dr. Laurie Rush, Cultural Resources Manager and Native American Affairs Coordinator for the 10th Mountain Division and Fort Drum. Auring has been instrumental in raising awareness about the plight of the Kurdish people and advocating for their rights. As KG Lobby Center, they have tirelessly fought for the acknowledgement of the atrocities committed against the Kurdish people and have worked to ensure that their history and suffering are not forgotten. Throughout her career, she's worked extensively with women organizations, specifically Kurdish women and refugees, showcasing her commitment to promoting gender equality and empowering women. Imran's Kashmir-related work involves research, writing, and advocacy to improve understanding of historic and contemporary realities and to promote accountability for rights violations. He has done human rights-related work on Kashmir since the late 1990s independently and through various organizations, including the Kashmir Law and Justice Project. He holds a JD from Harvard Law School. Laurie is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Her research specialty is Native Americans of the Great Lakes. She's an Army Archaeologist. Laurie is a research associate of the Smithsonian Institution, a University of Pennsylvania consulting scholar, secretary of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, and is internationally recognized for her work on military education for protection of cultural heritage. Laurie holds a BA from Indiana University Bloomington, an MA and PhD from Northwestern University. Thank you for joining us today, speakers. Images of mass graves are often associated with armed conflict or in the context of international crimes. The term mass grave has no agreed upon or common legal definition in international law. Yet, in addition to Additional Protocol 1 under international humanitarian law, there are a number of legal protocols dedicated to promoting protection of mass graves and safeguarding the dignity of the dead. Speakers, in your specific situations, how did your community discover or how did you come to learn about mass graves? What was the response of your community and the government where they're located? Please give our participants an idea of your specific context. And Auring will have you start.
Thank you very much, Vi. In the Kurdish case, it's kind of odd. Why do I say odd? Because there has been many mass graves in Kurdistan, and for many decades. It's not just for one period of time, but from the 60s to the 70s, and then you have the Saddam Hussein's regime, and he's starting atrocities against Kurds. So therefore, there are many mass graves in Kurdistan. Some of them are still not still be discovered. The ones who are discovered were discovered by people who are working in the south, because most of the mass graves, especially those from the Anfal and the Barzanis and many Failis, are put in the south, while the Kurdish people live in the north. So, they were discovered, most of the mass graves were discovered by the people who live in the south. Either they work in fields or in fact, there have been some people who witnessed army at the time of the Iraqi regime killing people in the desert, or being there saying like there should be some mass graves, or we have found Kurdish clothing there, or we have found remains of them. So that's how they found it. In terms of what has governments done for Kurdish people in Iraq, it's very, very hard, because we have basically no saying in bringing back our people. You can't, because the one who decides the decision making is in central Iraqi government. They are helped by UNAMI, they are helped by some international groups who help them out, but the role of the Kurdish people itself, it's minimum. It's really minimum. So if you look at it, we have like thousands of remains, thousands of family are still waiting, for their relatives to come back. But by the speed is going right now, it will take another 100 years for everyone to be back on the soils of Kurdistan, which is absolutely unacceptable. But what can we do except if there is no support from the international community saying we need to maybe do this differently? We have to do this differently. When you're talking about in Iraq, as you know, there are many different cultures. Two main cultures: you have the Arabs and you have the Kurds. The Kurdish, in the Kurdish community, most of those mass graves are from Kurds. Yeah, it is sort of an unacceptable actually to dig up a mass grave, yeah, located, saying that's it. I mean, all the mass graves in the town, they are not really protected. They're not even protected, which means that the remains, they are still not excavated. But because they are not protected, they can actually, they can actually get lost. The remains, evidence, things can get lost. That's just not the way that it should be done. And we truly do need help with that. As Kurdish people, we need help with that, because we are hopeless with the Iraqi government. They say, look, we are the decision makers. We are the one who's going to tell you when to get it out and how many of you can come and see it. We do get the chance to go there once they excavate it, but they pinpoint out so many people should come with us, but we have nothing else. Even the identification, the DNA is done in central Iraq, in Baghdad. Not, we as Kurds, we don't have a hand in it. We don't have any saying in it, except just walk around. When they ask us, we go there, and that's it.
And Imran, is your situation the same or similar in any way?
There are similarities. There are differences too, and I'm happy to describe, the situation as we know it in the context of, and I'm speaking specifically about Indian administered Kashmir. Kashmir is the territory that has various states occupying it, 3 states occupying it, but I'm focused on Indian administered Kashmir, which is the region where there's been the most severe repression and grave violations for many, many decades. So in the sense that Ari was talking about this repetitive, cyclical, ongoing sort of nature of a phenomenon like mass graves, that's true in Kashmir. The politics and other things are quite different. In this context, since the end of the British Raj in August of 1947, there's at least 3 eras or episodes of mass killing that produced unmarked and mass graves. The first was in 1947 itself. That incident or that period is known as the Jammu Massacre. About 200,000 people were killed in about 6 weeks. The population of that province is about 2 million at that time. To my knowledge, those graves have never been discovered. Information about those killings themselves have been systematically suppressed for many decades, so little is known about that. There's a second era of mass killing that began in 1989 and ended, albeit that year period to 2019. And that's the era that I'll say a little bit more, in terms of details about. That's an era from which unmarked and mass graves have been discovered. I'll describe that briefly. Subsequent to 2019, the killings and other grave violations in Kashmir have continued. One feature of the post-2019 period, so to the current day, is that there's an official policy that was instituted nominally as a COVID protocol, COVID-19 protocol to ban public funerals and also to forcibly bury bodies for anyone who the state claims is a armed resistance fighter or militant, or however they characterize people. And by the state's own numbers, from mid-2019 till about mid-2022, so about 2 years ago, and this has gone on, but it's the last public figures that I've seen, they buried forcibly in unmarked graves about 560 people, 600 people. So I'm going to go back to 1989 to 2019, that period of time. So between 1990 and 2009, civil society activists working on the ground, documented approximately 7,500 unmarked and mass grave sites in Kashmir. So this is the most militarized place on the planet and has been for many decades. So the context is one of heavy militarization and brutal repression and impunity for violations. Consequent to that, there are about 100,000 extrajudicial killings and 8 to 10,000 enforced disappearances in this time period. Indian military and police units systematically abducted and disappeared, tortured, executed, did so freely with impunity and would dump bodies. It was common, and it remains common, for the military to conscript people for forced labor and also to expropriate their property or resources. So in these cases, the military typically identified land, forced villagers, typically villagers, to dig graves on that land and then bury people who were unidentified without any rights and without any markings. Later, civil society activists came through. They would interview villagers who knew they buried these bodies, they knew where the graves were, and they identified those graves under military surveillance and severe limitations on their work and extreme risk of reprisal, both for the activists and anybody who would work with them. The activists were not able themselves to exhume bodies, but they did do identification work. Their purpose in doing this work was to really bolster an ongoing call for an independent international investigation into various phenomena, including these unmarked graves, enforced disappearances, etc. What happened is that there was a body called the State Human Rights Commission, which was a local body that was a state body. So, and the state is a violator. This was a limited body. One of the ways in which it was limited, it had no prosecutorial or powers or ability to really provide remedies, but they could do investigations and provide recommendations to the government. And what it was functionally was a venue for people who were very bold and very persistent and willing to risk severe reprisals to try to get their cases heard. There was not a judicial venue for these things in Kashmir. This body was shut down in 2019 and no longer functions, but it had been officially investigating thousands of unmarked and mass graves across Kashmir brought to it by these activists. So those activists had to overcome state obstructionism and disinformation and reprisals. And in 2014, that commission recommended that the government do the work of identifying the bodies, exhume, DNA tests, etc. So they acknowledged the existence of these unmarked and mass graves. They also recommended the government disclose the records that it had, have a commission of inquiry, and also to compensate, victims' families. The government rejected all of those recommendations and did none of them. And one of the primary articulated reasons is an ongoing phenomenon, and it's a disinformative sort of thing. Is they said if there were bodies in these graves, they would all just be what they called foreign terrorists, which is the trope that the government often uses to describe, the problem in Kashmir is foreign terrorism, although it never has been and is not today. So there are some rare instances where pressure resulted in bodies being exhumed. The activists involved investigated 50 cases. What they were able to determine through their investigation is that none of the bodies of these 50 was a foreigner. They were all locals, and this is typical in Kashmir. Again, it's rare that you have exhumations, but when they do happen, forgive me one second. Sorry, I just needed to adjust my computer. When these exhumations did happen, and they're rare, it always turns out that these people are locals. And in these cases, you had 49 of these people that were local civilians who had been executed and forcibly buried, and you had one who was identified as someone who had participated in armed resistance against the state. With the closure of that commission in 2019, all the files and all the records that people had developed, they were all abandoned and subsequently, to our knowledge, destroyed. There's no longer a venue for these cases, and all of the physical evidence that existed of these mass graves, including the graves themselves, has either already disappeared or is disappearing. There are reprisals that are longstanding but ongoing against victims' families and the activists who brought these cases, lawyers who were involved. So for the state, at this point, any discussion or acknowledgement of these issues or issues like them, or the seeking of truth or justice for them, is considered to be terrorism. And all of the people involved in that kind of work, which we would normally call human rights work, are terrorists. So one of the features of today is that the surviving civil society activists who are involved in this work are either currently under prosecution for terrorism or are threatened with being charges of terrorism being brought against them. So in short, that's a summary of the context of this issue in Kashmir.
At one point, there was an office in India tasked with identifying mass graves as well. Do you know if that government had continued those efforts?
I don't know about that office specifically, but they did not do work in Kashmir to my knowledge. And it could be the case. I don't know the function of the office, but Kashmir is often considered exceptional. So whatever might have applied elsewhere probably didn't apply in Kashmir, but I don't know the work of that office. Did not work in Kashmir.
And then Laurie, turning to you, could you give an overview about your situation as well?
Yes, I do want to mention that I'm not speaking as officially on behalf of the Army or the Department of Defense. So my observations and concerns are my own. But as the Army Archaeologist and Cultural Resource Manager at Fort Drum, New York, I've had the privilege of working with our Indigenous partners, Oneida, Mohawk, and Onondaga. And I also, in my capacity as the cemetery responsible official for a small prisoner of war cemetery on Fort Drum, have had direct experience working with the Office of Army Cemeteries. And as a result, I became very interested in issues surrounding the Carlisle Barracks Army Cemetery, which includes remains of at least 189 Indigenous children who died at Carlisle when it was the residential Indian school. And in fact, it was one of the very first residential Indian schools in the United States, and tragically served as a model for the kinds of abusive treatment of these children as it was duplicated across the US. And recently, Secretary Haaland has completed the first part of her investigation of residential schools and the losses of those children. Essentially, they were a tool of Indigenous genocide in the US. And during the course of her investigations, her team has found 417 federal residential boarding schools and an additional 100 private schools. And now the latest numbers appear to be at least 65 cemeteries. So that would be associated with these places, keeping in mind that these institutions were in operation for over 150 years, involving tens, if not hundreds of thousands of children. So at this point, I suspect that our estimates of lost and buried children right now, which an official estimate is somewhere in the range between 900 and 1,000 children, but tragically, I think we're going to discover thousands more. And of particular interest is the question of having official Army responsibility for nearly 200 of these children, and then looking at all of the challenges surrounding the efforts of the families who want these children to come home. And I noticed that Aring mentioned in the Kurdish case, we have families waiting. And that is also the case with our Indigenous children. And many would say, well, gosh, it's been 10 years, it's been 100 years, but not every culture measures time in the same way. And I can tell you that for these Indian families, that loss of those children, the kidnapping of those children, happened as if it was yesterday. And we have the intergenerational trauma, not just of the lost children, but also the abused children who came home and then struggle with that legacy and struggle with the challenges of organizing their own futures and then raising their children. But in the meantime, folks are waiting. And that's, to me, one of the most compelling aspects of my concerns with the Army's approach to repatriating the Carlisle children. And I think, I mean, now as we look at a challenge of over 500 potential locations of buried children, known cemeteries, 65 known cemeteries, the Army has an opportunity, in my personal opinion, to serve as a model for proactivity and developing thoughtful and compassionate and empathetic approaches to identifying these children and making sure that they get home. At one point, I was talking with one of my Indian colleagues, and her comment was the elders are dying, and many of these elders want to see the children home before they pass away. So the timing element to me is important. And you also, I think we have another similarity with the Kurdish case, where you have this situation of people in power who feel in control of these interments and then want to make all of the rules for access, for ceremonies, and ultimately for the repatriation process. And so as we speak, some of the Indian nations that have managed to make arrangements have all of their bureaucratic paperwork in place with respect to the Carlisle Cemetery, are now being told, well, it's just not in the 2024 work plan, but we'll try to get it into the 2025 budget. And so you have these bureaucratic efforts and excuses that just result in delay. And I think one of the accurate descriptions in the Indian media is a approach. They use the term tone deaf, and I think that sadly that's a pretty accurate term. And what I'm looking forward to our further discussion of suggestions for fixing some of these situations. And what I find really frustrating is that the U.S. Department of Defense has an extremely proactive consultation policy. They've already developed the solution. And one of our big challenges is Army cemeteries failing to follow it. So we have some bureaucratic answers, and I'll be happy to discuss those possibilities when it's my turn again.
No, you can go ahead, Dr. Rush, and also speakers, if you want to speak to each other as well, please feel free to do so.
So in the early 2000s, the Native Hawaiians successfully sued the Department of Defense and ended military training in the Makua Valley, which is a very, very sacred place. And even though the land had been leased to the Army was failing to show respect for the sacred features and sacred sites within the valley. And when the Native Hawaiians won in court, we had a brilliant lawyer at the Department of Defense, Jim Van Ness, who recognized immediately that training land could be lost from coast to coast if other indigenous nations were to sue the Department of Defense. And as a result, he developed our consultation policy, which essentially says you will treat we call them federally recognized tribes, but they're essentially sovereign indigenous nations, and you will treat them as such. You will show respect when we host their leaders. They're treated as this with the same protocol as we would treat any foreign leader. And then you will establish partner relationships, get to know each other, talk to them about the various challenges that you face. So, for example, we have buried ancestors on Fort Drum. And so we reach out to our nation partners to talk about our protection measures. When we do new construction and we find ancestral places, we now work in partnership with Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk to come up with the preservation solutions. So once those relationships are established, you can accomplish all kinds of wonderful things. And so sadly, if the folks at Army cemeteries were to follow the Department of Defense consultation policy, they would stop attempting to impose arbitrary, maybe not arbitrary, but rules they have created for disinterment of soldier remains. They're trying to apply those rules to disinterment of Indian children. And it makes no sense. Disinterment of a soldier's remains from an Army cemetery is a completely different kind of challenge and process than the kind of question of sending a child home. And they need to be talking with the family members and nation members of the lost children. How do they want those remains recovered? What kinds of concerns do they have about identification of unknown remains? What kind of a process would they be comfortable with? And those folks need to be hosted at Carlisle with respect and welcomed. And Carlisle should be reaching out to the nations. They shouldn't be waiting to be sued in order for a child to go home. And so ultimately, we're looking at shared humanity. We're looking at asking a federal agency, in this case, the Army, for empathy and compassion for the families and nations of the lost young ones.
Aaron, could you talk a little bit more about kind of the responsiveness of the governments or lack of it, as well as access issues that you've encountered in your situation?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Rush. It's very nice to hear that in the United States, in the US, you've managed to partner up and do really something good with it. Yeah, but I was just, one of the questions before I give you an answer, one of the questions that I have for Dr. Rush is in terms of internationally, partnership on the international level. How do you, is that even possible? Because as Imran said, and me too, we really do need the international community and organizations to help us pass this, because this is not only to give the fallen the dignity and bury them in their own land, but also their families, give them a peace of mind, get them out of their miseries. At least they would know what happened to them, and they would know it for sure they were in the mass grave. That is very important. But we're coming into a dead end in terms of where do we have to go to, because anyone we talk to, we as KG Lobby Center, we have talked to many other organizations, experts, lawyers on the international arena, asking like, look, we have this struggle with the mass graves. The Iraqis, central Iraqi government is the one who's responsible, who has given the responsibility to bring back all and to excavate all the mass graves, take the remains to Baghdad for DNA testing, and then send them back to Kurdistan. This whole process takes like ages. It takes ages. What is the role of the Kurdistan regional government? As you all know, we have the Kurdistan regional government in North Iraq. Their role is actually minimum. While they could and they should get a better role in it, like a role that you can be a decision maker. Let them do it themselves. Let them do it, because you're talking about a whole different, it's a different culture. These are different people. And the worst thing is, I'm not saying like Arabs and Kurds, but the fact is those Kurds were killed by Arabs. And here you go now, as the UN or anyone who's trying to do something good in Iraq, they're putting the Arabs in charge of bringing back what they killed themselves. That just doesn't add, does it? Yeah, that just literally hurts. And then you have in the south of Iraq, many families, Dr. Rush just mentioned something that is very similar in Kurdistan. I've talked to one of the survivors. At the time, he was a young boy. Now he's probably 56. So if he's now 56, his father, his uncles, his brothers and everything, he was saying, literally, he said, yeah, many of them were taken, but I'm sure many of them were taken to mass graves, but I'm still waiting for them to come back, because in his mind, they just don't know it. In his mind, they're coming back. Well, if you look at it factually, it's just not logical for his father to come back while his neighbor, his uncle, everybody's dead. Why not his father and his brother? But that's the trauma he's in. He lives in it day and night, and he gives it to his children as well, and his children to their children. There you go, the generational trauma of the massacre, because they will always be a victim, not knowing what has happened. Where are they? You cannot finish it. There is no ending, because literally you just don't know what happened. Their remains are in the south, yeah, but the Iraqi government is just not so far to bring them all back. So you have families, they're waiting and waiting and waiting. Many of them die. Many of them die of old age or diseases and never had the chance of closure. That is just very sad. And I think it's also inhuman. I think we live in a world where we have so many advocates and so many lawyers, so many human rights lawyers, so many human rights organizations, and we're talking about, yes, we need a better world. What kind of a better world do we need if we do not stand up for all the nations, for all indigenous people? Yeah. Once we do that, then we can say like, yeah, we're living in a world where an international lawyer is truly taking cases of international, let's say, people, Kurds, Indian, of people from Kashmir, then we can be one. That's what we need. Of course, advocating, there's saying that by the fact the work is really important. It's you honor the dead, but also to serve the living by giving them some understanding of what happened. I mean, till now, nobody knows what happened. Yes, we've all been into atrocity. We all know like that it was a brutal government, and we have many mass graves. Okay, we have many mass graves. When are they coming back? Why am I, as a Kurd, not allowed? Let's say, you have. Why aren't the Kurdish people allowed to be in charge of bringing back the mass graves? Why aren't we supported in that? That is something that I really don't have the answer for. I've asked it. I have asked it directly in Iraq, and they say like, well, that's how it works. That's the line we have set up from the central government. That's how we work. But why? What is the role of the international community in this, of the international lawyers in this? What is the role of the UN in this? Surely there must be a way to fix it, because in the speed that it's going now, it will take more than 100 years to bring them all back into the soil of Kurdistan. Is that something that we as human rights activists or human rights lawyers would be proud of? I truly doubt it. I think we should really address this case, because it's very important in terms of living in a world where we are responsible for what happens. It's a learning curve for all of us. If there's an atrocity in one country, yeah, the whole world can learn from it, how to deal with this, how to, the grieving families who live, how are you going to contact them? How are you going to, you cannot fix it, absolutely not, but you can give them closure. That you can give them the families back, the remaining of the families back. That is something that we absolutely miss in Kurdistan, in North Iraq.
Dr. Rush, before you answer, I'm going to jump to Imran because I saw you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I mean, thank you both for your comments. I think it's really, I want to mention a couple of things. One is about the nature of the people that we're talking about who have been subject to this form of violation and violence. I think it's really important to understand that, like, we're talking about three contexts. These are not the only three. There are many contexts of mass killing and mass graves. But in all cases, you see that they are, if I can use the term, marginalized people. They are people whose lives matter less, if they matter at all. I think the second thing is that we're also talking about the apparatuses of powerful states or groups that are very closely aligned with a powerful state. And I think it's really important to understand as we think about, we're talking about very grave violations, the killing and disrespect of people. If you think about it from a law standpoint, we're talking about the right to life, something very fundamental. And we don't have to go to the law to know just how fundamental that is, but it's very fundamental. There's a question about, like, how did these things happen in the first place? And what we're talking about now is, how do they become unsolvable or unaddressable? And why do they remain so? And I just want to make a point about, we have notions, I think people here are mostly lawyers, you have notions about law and the rule of law, things like that. And these ideas are ideas about, there are some rules, they are intended to be fairly applied, people should have equal access to them, etc. And when you look at these cases, you see that the rule of law is fiction for most of these people most of the time. And it's in the interest of powerful states and groups to, at most, to reference Dr. Rush's comments, to be obstructionist, if I can use that term, or to outright deny. Like, I don't know in the case of Iraq and Kurdistan, whether the government, has always acknowledged that there are graves and maybe sometimes deny them altogether. But I think it's quite common in Kashmir, for example, these things are denied. And the question, you have a system. If you don't think about beyond our morality and our values and what we should stand up for, if you think about how weak a system of law, how weak an international order we have, and as you put stress on it, what does it actually show us? Because these things that are very, very fundamental to its legitimacy, things like fundamental human rights, things like the right to life. And I would also mention that in all these three cases, one of the things that's kind of involved is something that's a principle and a right at the root of the international system that we have, is the idea of self-determination of people. Dr. Rush mentioned that the protocol of the military is to treat the heads of indigenous tribes in the US as like foreign states. They're intended to be sovereign states, etc. And these notions get eroded and lost, and they don't really exist in a robust manner. But these are fundamental to the system that we live in. And if we as lawyers, and I'm speaking as a lawyer now, don't defend them, don't stand up for them, particularly for the people who are least able because of their historic marginalization, and also their limited access. Even today, their histories have been erased. Their stories are systematically, disappeared. We are not able, the right to even be heard doesn't exist for most of these people most of the time. If lawyers and other institutions don't stand up for them and fight for them, we really are participating not only in the continuation of grave violations, but also in the further weakening of what is already a very weak international system. And I can describe that from a Kashmiri point of view, but I just want to sort of focus on the specific phenomenon, think about the nature of the victims and the nature of the violators, and look at what we're talking about across a few contexts. And I think it's actually a very, very profound thing and very important, not just from a moral perspective, but from a legal and functional perspective. You think about a world that is, even today, and I would say increasingly today, suffering many, many crises that are very significant, and you need a robust international system to address these global crises. So sorry to go on. And one last thing maybe also to say is, Dr. Rush, and you mentioned like ideas, and I think one of the things that we found in our work, and I wouldn't say we've been wildly successful, but we've tried, and where we have found in our own work and people that are adjacent to us, some success in causing the things that are supposed to happen, even according to existing policies, to happen where they're not happening, is by public pressure that involves really, I mean, to use a coarse word, shaming, right? But basically juxtaposing the claimed values of the government or the institution and the reality. And it takes a lot of work to do that often because these histories have been erased, these realities are denied. But if we can do that successfully and bring other people who are not, for example, just Kurds fighting in Kurdistan, or just Kashmiris fighting in Kashmir, but other people who are just on a principled basis, they care, you can create the kind of dynamic that results in formerly obstructionist or unwilling to respond powerful bodies being more willing to respond because they, at a minimum, just want these things become kind of messy and they want them to go away, and you can see a response. So that's been my experience for what it's worth.
Dr. Rush, if you'd like to jump in.
Well, and actually, I was also going to mention, he's absolutely right about the public pressure. One of the reasons why some of the children have gone home is not only the combination of lawsuits, but then the media coverage. U.S. Army cemeteries being sued again. And that's just horrifically embarrassing. And that public pressure has been helpful and valuable. I do think too, if we look at contrast the U.S. situation with the Canadian situation, again, you see the effect of public pressure, and then the pushing for things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In listening to Canadian radio, issues of truth, reconciliation, recovery of boarding schools in intergenerational trauma, I would say that's on the CBC News, if at least once a week, featured somewhere in some form. We're just not seeing that in the American media. And even someone like me with a direct connection to the U.S. military, and of course, our division is in the Middle East all the time, we haven't heard anything about the challenge of the Kurdish mass graves. And so I think that there is that potential for trying to get that education, but also the opportunity for these people to share and tell their stories too. I mean, because understanding those stories has a direct effect on how people view and interact with the victims and the marginalized people. The more it's much more difficult to turn a blind eye from someone when you know their personal story of loss and trauma than it is to someone who seems more anonymous. So room for more education and storytelling, and then combined with public pressure. I think all of those offer solutions. I don't know if it's a darker note, but also the Department of Defense didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, I think it would be great to have a good proactive Indigenous policy. Department of Defense woke up and said, if we don't change our approach, we're going to lose all our training land. So finding real life causes, effects, costs, and benefits, I think can be tremendously powerful too.
Dr. Rush, did you have an answer for Auring's question about what can the international community do? Maybe if you draw from your experiences as well with NATO or others that you find relevant.
Oh, it's a tough question. I think definitely the media coverage that is one. But yes, I think bringing these issues more specifically to alliances like NATO, also perhaps approaching some of what we would call our civil affairs or CIMIC units, where we have soldiers who are interested in assisting with local governance. NATO has a very proactive stability policing unit that works to help countries that are experiencing challenges with disruptions in civil society, but also then helping coach in terms of rule of law. So for example, the Italians have been very active in Iraq in terms of training Iraqi police to be more Western style community policing, less abusive policing, those kinds of things. So I do think there could be perhaps some behind the scenes diplomacy involving military organizations in perhaps some unexpected ways. And military lawyers, for sure.
Ms. Ken, I see your hand is raised. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for these very interesting presentations. I wanted to actually ask whether to Laurie maybe shouldn't the ICRC actually be involved in the cases of the Kurdish situation and maybe also in Kashmir, because it is connected to an armed conflict? Of course, not in the US and the Indian situation, but in the other cases, there should be involvement of the ICRC. Shouldn't there? Anyone?
It makes sense to me that they could be involved.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I'll sort of in the Kashmir context, I'll just say that the International Committee of the Red Cross has been involved historically, particularly in, I mentioned in my comments that like there's sort of multiple periods of really grave violations. In the early 1990s, the ICRC did have some involvement in access to Kashmiri prisoners. There's, mass incarceration and mass torture is an ongoing and longstanding phenomenon as it faces Kashmiris. And, we have a system that privileges sovereignty over everything. So the Indian government did not like the involvement of the ICRC and curtailed their work and ultimately basically forced them to not operate and, be involved at all. So by the late 90s, their work was very limited to nothing. So I think, it's a unique body, the International Committee of the Red Cross. They do amazing work, but it does require the cooperation of governments. And so if you have governments that, as I was saying, are obstructionist at best, denialist, or this is in their interest. I mean, they really want, like in the Kashmir context, there are specific laws that ensure as a matter of the law that a government soldier can commit any violation and cannot be prosecuted for that violation. It's legalized impunity, totally. And there's very little that one can do when it's in the government's interest. So I don't say that to be sympathetic to the ICRC. I mean, I think the international organizations need to be much more vocal. And one of the things you sort of see has been my experience in working on issues related to this context for a long time, is that what you do not see is a body like the ICRC or anyone. The ICRC is really principled about the neutrality. You have other groups that are not, that's not one of their main principles. When they are intimidated, assaulted, prevented from doing their work by the government, they will not say that out loud. That's true also of diplomats from different states. Even if they are intimidated and assaulted by, for example, the Indian Foreign Service, they won't say it out loud. And the reason always is that if we say this out loud, then we'll no longer have any access. They've already been denied access. And they say we'll no longer have access. So you have, and it's kind of what I was saying to Dr. Rush about, like, these things have to be public in some way. If you don't create the public conversation about these things, and it matters who's bringing the conversation. If I do it, it doesn't mean that much. If you had someone from the ICRC talking out loud about these issues, or from the United States, State Department talking about these issues, it would mean something different, given the relative privilege of that position. But so, anyways, I just say that to say that in the Kashmir context, at least, the ICRC as a body has been involved, but is really no longer functional as a result of government action. I also mentioned just one other thing, just so you guys are clear. Sorry, V, but we're talking about the international community. I mean, you should know that Kashmir is under direct UN auspices since January 1, 1948. Like, there are UN observers that are in Kashmir and have been for decades and decades. This is actually one of the fundamental issues at the outset, kind of post-World War II, the establishment of the international order. Kashmir is one of the first and primary issues that shapes that dynamic, including at the Security Council. And so it's been on the international agenda. It has direct international involvement. The UN is directly involved throughout these decades that I'm talking about. All these things are happening. And you see occasionally like a special rapporteur or something of the UN describing some of these issues, but you don't see any real action. And the reason at the end is that you have to have concerted political pressure brought by powerful states, and they are unwilling to do that in this context.
Do we only have about a few minutes left? I see there's one person here who's unmuted. I don't know if there was a question, but if not, we'll go back to the speakers to let you provide concluding remarks as you see fit. Okay, all right. So then we'll go around again to Aring. If you could start us off, please.
It is very important for the entire international community, not just to say like locally, I am an activist or I'm a lawyer or I have a governmental job. We will do it for my own government. Dr. Rush, it's really good to see that the work you're doing, it's not only limited to the US. I truly do hope that, knowing the fact that your team or yourself are very familiar with North Iraq and you work in the Middle East, I truly do hope that you would at least put it in a discussion or evaluate what is going on in Kurdistan or in North Iraq concerning the mass graves. Yes, it's kind of strange to me that you, as such a high position, have not heard about the struggles we have with the mass graves and bringing back our relatives. While the whole world knows there has been so many mass graves in Iraq, all of them in South, with 70% of it, more than 70% of it are Kurdish mass graves with Kurdish bodies in it. And till now, we don't even have like 5% of it back on the Kurdish soil. So even only that should raise questions. Only that should raise questions. Why isn't this process not going? Why is not working? And one of the questions that Imran had was like, I'm not sure if the Iraqi government does acknowledge it. Yes, they cannot not acknowledge it because, well, the mass graves, you can see they're blindfolded they're all wearing Kurdish clothing. They can find the clothing, they can find their belongings, or at least they were blindfolded by their own clothes. So yes, they do acknowledge it, only the whole process it goes through the central Iraqi government, which that makes it very hard for the Kurdish people or the Kurdistan regional government to do anything about it. But right now we're kind of really stuck. If we go to the UNAMI, if we go to the UN, everybody goes like, yeah, central Iraqi government takes care of it. But in reality, they don't. They don't. They just say, yes, we're busy, we're working on it. Working on what? Many relatives have died, so they have never had the chance to have closure. And from where it's going right now, in the coming 10 years, many other generation will die, and also they will not have closure. They are victims and they will stay victims, and their families will stay victims too, unless we in the international community do something about it. It's not enough. I don't think it's enough to say like it's not in our hand, because there is, as this world, as an international community, it's our obligation to make sure that atrocities will never happen nowhere again. Of course, it does happen, but now we know it has happened in the past. If we don't do anything about it, it will be forgotten. It will absolutely be forgotten. And I did want to say thank you very much that you gave us the chance to at least explain what our problem is a little bit.
Thank you. Imran?
Yeah, thank you all. I think what I might do is kind of pick up on what I was just talking about a little bit, because one thing is very unique about Kashmir is that it is this issue that has been on the international agenda since 1948, the very beginning of 1948. So to kind of give you guys a sense, you might recall that in December of last year, 2023, there was big celebrations around the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't know if you guys were following that, but it was in the international, space. It was widely celebrated. You have direct UN Security Council resolutions regarding the rights of the Kashmiri people that come before even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from April of 1948. And what you see in the context like Kashmir is that you have 76 plus years of grave violations under direct UN auspices, with UN observers observing, and total impunity for those violations. And I want to bring it back to, I think most people are probably American, or at least as an American, nexus. We're talking about histories that are erased and forgotten. It would not be probably something that you all know, but the US at the outset and throughout these decades has been the most influential state on how the UN and other bodies, and how it's been very important US foreign policy also, have dealt with the situation in Kashmir. The US has been disproportionately the most influential state on Kashmir. And if you think about the contrast, you have Americans, and to Dr. Rush's point, not all Americans have benefited the same way, but the US is the state that has benefited the most from the international order, if you think about it just in broad terms. And Kashmiris, as I mentioned before, marginalized people, no state, etc. I would imagine, like the Kurds, these are the people that are in the exact inverse position. They've benefited the least. In fact, they suffered the most as by virtue of the order that we have. It's really important to understand from an international peace and security standpoint that this issue has been acknowledged as, known as, for many, many reasons, to be a critical issue, and it is completely ignored today. I think it's the place that shows us, we sort of see, and there's many contemporary contexts, and the most emotive is Israel-Palestine, where you sort of see how frayed and fractured things are. When you really sort of see what's happening, how frayed, forget about your people's relative perspectives on what's happening, but just how frayed and fractured things are. Going back to how did we get here? What is happening? If you look at the situation in Kashmir, it tells you a lot about how we got where we got, and the things that have not been dealt with, and things have not been addressed, and the kinds of things that we collectively have been okay with, and what that has resulted in. So I think it's, as Americans, again, I'll say the US is the most influential, it remains the most influential state. It's very important, in this context, the US has been, I would say, facilitated, illegal occupation, colonization, the denial of every kind of right, including what we're talking about here, the right to life. It's been something that we've accepted as a matter of, Americans have accepted as a matter of foreign policy. I'll also say, India, the violator in this context, has been celebrated as like a leader of the, if you say third world or global south or whatever, it's a post-colonial constitutional democracy. And what's interesting is India's policies in Kashmir, which are policies of colonial domination and have been for decades, have been instrumental to India's path towards what people recognize now as a electoral autocracy, repressive state, where institutions aren't functioning well, et cetera, et cetera. It's the allowance of the kind of repression you have in Kashmir that has facilitated, in a way, the destruction of whatever potential India had to be a robust democracy. And again, India is a very influential, powerful state, very important today in the contemporary global order, and a very close partner of the US as a fellow democracy. The claim is that we have shared values, et cetera. When you think about what Dr. Rush is talking about, indigenous people in the US, what Aaron's talking about in terms of some of these US partners in Iraq and what's been allowed and what's not being dealt with, I think it's really damning and profound. And it's important for us, again, as lawyers, to think about, what we've been okay with, what's happening, what we allow to go on without really being addressed. I think the last thing I'll say is India is also one of the really most influential, I would say, countries on global counterterrorism policy. They are training people, they're holding conferences, et cetera, including in the UN system. And I'll say again that the people that stand up for rights, journalists, human rights defenders, et cetera, they are persecuted and prosecuted under counterterrorism laws by India systematically. widely. And it's that country that's shaping global counterterrorism policy. The very people that are holding up the values that the international community claims are its foundational values, like human rights. Those are the people that are being targeted by the country that's celebrated as a leader on counterterrorism. So I'll leave you with that.
Thanks very much, Imran. And Dr. Rush, could you please give some concluding thoughts as well?
So I'd really like to thank you, Avi, for organizing this session. And I think it's brilliant that you're bringing these issues in such a compelling way to the attention of the legal community. And one reason why I have found it really rewarding to work with law enforcement and the military on heritage issues is that opportunity to go back to try to bring these our states, our sovereign states, and the international community back to the rule of law, back to following the ideals that many of these states were founded on, the reasons why we tell our soldiers they're going to war, and the ideals and values they're defending. And lawyers are the key to that, because you are the ones with the tools and knowledge to try and make these systems work better, and many times to do the heavy lifting behind the scenes, whether it's drafting documents or planning lawsuits, and using the legal tools as best we can to try to address some of these tragic and challenging issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, speakers, and to our attendees today. We hope you will join us in the fall for the second part of this topic, where we will offer a discussion on international law and how it could be better enforced to protect mass graves, and what other issues are missing from the current mechanisms that exist under international law. Thank you, everybody. Please enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon.
Thank you very much.